Tonight, we wander into fog-choked streets of London. December 1811, a city of gas lamps, creaking carts, and whispered fears. On Ratcliffe Highway, William Taylor's shop became a scene of unspeakable horror. His throat cut, his wife crushed beneath overturned furniture, their infant left alone in terror. No motive, no mercy, no one to claim them. And yet, within days, the city buzzed with panic and speculation, the questions slicing sharper than any headline. Who walked Ratcliffe Highway that night? The authorities called it investigated. The city called it haunted. And over 2 centuries later, we're still listening to the shadows. There's a ledger, yellowed with age, tucked somewhere in the grimy offices of London's Old Bailey archives. A clerk once flipped its pages and paused, recoiling as if the ink itself had bitten him. The entry was simple, clinical almost. Thursday, December 7th, 1811. Mr. William Taylor, found in his shop. Throat cut, wife crushed beneath debris. Blood, so much blood. But beneath the words, beneath the neat lines, is the smell of terror that no paper can hold. They say Taylor's screams, if you squint against time, still echo between Ratcliffe Highway's crooked, gaslit streets, slipping into the ears of anyone who dares wander too close. Imagine a man, half asleep in the dark, hearing the faint scuff of boots and the metallic scrape of steel across wood. He peers through a grimy window, just in time to see a shadow vanish into fog, leaving his neighbor's butchered family as a grotesque tableau for the dawn. You might think, at first, that the world will sober itself and the authorities will step in. But the horror, the unhinged, pulsing kind, has a way of hiding in plain sight, and the night itself becomes conspirator. London in 1811 wasn't merely foggy. It was soaked in oil lamps, rickety cartwheels, and the ever-present stink of sewage. But there, beneath the gaslight, the Ratcliffe Highway Murders will unfold like a grotesque puppet show, limbs arranged like morbid symphonies, letters scrawled with trembling hands, and yet no one could find conductor. Each discovery, the first, then the second, then the third, felt like a crack in reality itself, like the city's heart was skipping beats and someone, somewhere, was laughing at its failure to keep order. There's an eyewitness statement that chills me every time I read it. A boy, hiding behind a doorframe, watching as a killer, if that's what you call a man, move with such methodical precision, slicing, cutting, arranging. He called it not human, not quite a man, which in hindsight might be the most accurate description ever given. Because the Ratcliffe Highway murder was not sloppy. He was a surgeon wielding panic instead of scalpels, turning domestic spaces into theaters of panic. And what strikes me, the detail that gnaws in the marrow, is that this wasn't a one-off. No, it was repetition, like a composer returning to the same sick refrain, daring the city to notice. Each victim, each household, each bloody morning, whispered the same horrifying message. Chaos can live on the narrow streets of civilization, smiling behind doorways, wearing the skin of normality. So picture it. You, standing outside your shop, the fog curling at your boots, unaware that someone inside your neighbor's kitchen is orchestrating a death that will ripple across newspapers, ballads, and the trembling memory of every Londoner who dares walk home alone at dusk. And then realize this. The ledger entry doesn't even capture it all. It cannot. Blood isn't words. Fear isn't ink. The city never truly recovers from what it witnessed along Ratcliffe Highway. London in 1811 was a city teetering on the edge of something it didn't want to admit it feared. Picture it. Narrow streets, twisting like a drunken spider's web. Buildings pressed close together, their timber frames groaning under the weight of centuries. The Thames, black and oily, churned like the city's own dark conscience, carrying refuse, secrets, and whispers of scandal downriver. Street lamps flickered weakly against the fog, offering only the illusion of safety. One misstep, one shadow too long, and you were lost to the chill, or worse. The population of Ratcliffe Highway itself was a curious mix. Dock workers with hands scarred by rope and salt, merchants stacking barrels in dim warehouses, and families crammed into garrets above shops, all breathing the same polluted air. Crime was endemic, of course, but it wore many masks. Pickpockets, conmen, and drunkards prowled the streets at night. But murder? Systematic, calculated, almost ritualistic murder? That was still supposed to be the domain of nightmares and sensational pamphlets. Not your neighbors. Not the families who waved to you every morning from over the bakery counter. And the city's law enforcement, bless them, was a fumbling, fragmented system. Foul street runners patrolled as best they could, but the concept of organized police, as we know it, was embryonic, laughably inadequate. Detectives? Rarely and mostly amateur. In a city this size, chaos was practically a civic feature. Rumor traveled faster than justice. One minute a neighbor was alive. The next they were the subject of whispered speculation, their absence filling the streets like a ghost. Then there was a social aspect. Fear wasn't just private, it was performative. The newspapers, those small, ink-stained things trembling under gaslight, traded on panic. Headlines screamed of horrors in Ratcliffe Highway and blood in the Merchant Quarter, and the public, hungry for both scandal and reassurance, devoured every word. Families barricaded doors, children clung to mothers, and every creak of timber or rattling chain could send the most rational man spinning into terror. Yet, amid all this, daily life trudged forward. Barges unloaded their cargo along the wharves, apprentices swept floors, and innkeepers poured ale for patrons desperate to forget the headlines outside. Death had a rhythm here, too, a morbid accompaniment to commerce, labor, and survival. The city's heart beat erratically, sometimes with a pulse of normality, sometimes with a drum of looming violence that no one wanted to name aloud. And that is the stage upon which the Ratcliffe Highway Murders would unfold. A city simultaneously bustling and suffocating, where fear could incubate in broad daylight, and terror could strike with the intimacy of a neighbor's handshake. It wasn't merely the geography of the place. It was its psychology. Narrow streets, tight communities, and poor lighting meant the murder could move almost unseen. And because law enforcement was so limited, every whisper, every frightened glance, every shadow in the corner of your eye became a potential omen. William Taylor was, on paper, a simple man, a shopkeeper of Ratcliffe Highway, selling provisions and household goods in a modest, tidy space above which he lived with his young wife Elizabeth and their infant son. If you imagine a man who lived quietly, whose life was more leisure than adventure, more domesticity than drama, Taylor fits the bill. Yet, there was an almost obsessive attention to order in his shop, a shelf for every spice, a jar for every grain, a ledger for every transaction. Some neighbors whispered that he was a bit too meticulous, bordering on neurotic, but most simply admired his diligence. Elizabeth, by all accounts, was gentle and industrious, keeping the home above the shop in near-perfect condition despite the cramped, smoke-filled quarters. Their life, modest as it was, carried the semblance of normalcy that people crave in the midst of chaos. There were no scandals, no deaths of note, no rumors, just a quiet hum of routine, interrupted only by the occasional drunken sailor staggering past the doorway or the clatter of barrels along the street. To think that this little family could be obliterated in a single night was the sort of notion people prefer to dismiss as fantasy, yet was about to become reality. And yet, it's impossible to study Taylor without noticing the undercurrent of anxiety in his life. Letters found after the murders hint at sleepless nights, repeated worries over security, and fleeting unease at shadows in the street. Perhaps it was just a natural caution of a man who lived in a densely packed, often lawless neighborhood. Or perhaps, in retrospect, it was a premonition of the horrors to come. People like Taylor don't usually figure into history books because their lives are ordinary, but that ordinariness is precisely what made him vulnerable. Then there's a peculiar detail that sticks in the mind like a shard of broken glass. A neighbor recalled, days before the tragedy, seeing Taylor examine the locks on his shop doors with unusual care. He supposedly muttered to himself, "Better safe than sorry," Though what exact threat he imagined, no one can say. It seems almost grotesque, ironic even, this obsessive care, this sense of small, manageable danger, clashing violently with the incomprehensible violence that would descend. The family's significance, beyond the tragedy, lies in their ordinariness. They were not wealthy, not influential, not notable in any way, except as the first household in a series of murders that would shock the city to its core. The story of the Ratcliffe Highway Murders does not begin with monsters. It begins with the mundane, the domestic, the familiar. It begins with people like William and Elizabeth Taylor, whose greatest crime was living quietly in the wrong street at the wrong time. And here's a chilling psychological twist. The more we dissect their lives, the more we realize that the ordinary is what makes horror so devastating. These were people who could not fight back, could not anticipate the intrusion of a calculated, almost ritualistic evil. Their humanity, their predictability, their very normality becomes a canvas upon which the murderer painted his grotesque masterpiece. It began in the dead of night, a night so silent that the occasional creak of a floorboard sounded like cannon fire. William Taylor had gone to bed as usual, Elizabeth tucking their infant close, and whispering the lullabies that tried to push back the cold of Ratcliffe Highway. But someone or something was already inside the house, moving with the calculated patience of a predator who knew the rhythms of his prey. The first disturbance wasn't a scream. No, that would have been mercifully brief. It was subtle, a sound too deliberate to be accidental. A drawer opening, then a pause, then the unmistakable scrape of steel on wood. Anyone else might have dismissed it as the wind or a loose shutter. Taylor did not. He rose, lantern in hand, only to be met with the chaos that would forever mark that night. In the kitchen, Elizabeth's body lay sprawled across the floor, crushed beneath a fallen shelf. Her husband's throat had been slashed, clean and efficient, almost clinical. Blood pooled in unnatural patterns. The faint metallic scent drifting up to where the infant cried, alone in its cradle. And yet, the grotesque attention to detail hinted at something beyond mere robbery or anger. The house had been disturbed, yes, but with intent. Objects moved, papers torn, signs left as if the murderer wanted witnesses, or wanted someone to reconstruct a horror that felt scripted, like a dark theater domestic life gone violently wrong. Neighbors arrived at the first glimmers of dawn, faces pale, hands shaking, disbelief in every gesture. Some reported hearing screams. Others claimed they heard nothing at all. The inconsistencies in the early accounts would haunt the investigation, like shadows in a painting that seemed almost alive. People spoke in whispers of a monster walking the streets of Ratcliffe Highway, but they were careful not to name it aloud. The word murderer felt insufficient, almost banal. How you describe a force that shatters the ordinary so completely? The first disturbance was both a literal and psychological jolt. It tore through perception of safety and community, leaving behind a residue of fear that would not easily dissipate. Mothers clutched children tighter. Shopkeepers bolted doors, and rumors spiraled faster than any official report could manage. Everyone instinctively sensed the underlying truth. This was not a random act. This was the opening note of a symphony of terror. Each subsequent murder another instrument added to the orchestra, playing a melody composed in shadows. Even the surviving infant seemed to register something wrong, wailing not merely for hunger or discomfort, but with sound that almost demands to be interpreted, as if the child understood the incomprehensible nature of the violence it had witnessed. That night, Ratcliffe Highway itself seemed to exhale, a collective shudder that ran through every crooked alley and narrow doorway. The first disturbance had shattered not only a family, but the fragile belief that domestic spaces were sacred. And somewhere in the mist, walking back into the shadowy streets, the perpetrator vanished, leaving behind a scene that no eyewitness account or ledger entry could ever truly capture. For anyone peering into the darkness, the message was unmistakable. Terror had a new address, and it would return. By the second day, the air over Ratcliffe Highway was thick with whispers, speculation, and the kind of unease that feels like it seeps into your bones. The city didn't just mourn. It theorized, gossiped, and spun intricate webs of conjecture that sometimes outpaced the facts themselves. Conflicting accounts emerged almost immediately. Some claimed they saw a man lurking near the scene the night of the murders, while others swore the streets had been empty. Each witness's memory seemed warped by fear, the fog, or the faint, lingering suggestion of horror already infecting their minds. Then came the second household. Incredibly, almost grotesquely, it mirrored the first in unsettling ways. Another family, another home on the same narrow, winding street, became the stage for violence that seemed both familiar and terrifyingly inventive. The pattern was undeniable. The killer targeted domestic spaces, leaving bodies arranged in ways that suggested not just malice, but an almost ritualistic satisfaction. This wasn't about theft or revenge. It was about control, about sending a message that the ordinary could be obliterated with precision. Newspapers thrived on the growing panic. One account claimed the murderer moves like a shadow made flesh, while another insisted the killings were divine punishment for some unseen sin. Londoners debated endlessly. Was it a foreign assassin, a lunatic, a vengeful spirit? Every theory clashed with another, and every contradiction only heightened the public's paranoia. The truth became impossible to separate from rumor. The mystery deepened like a wound that would not heal, adding to confusion with the small, inexplicable details that hinted at something off-kilter. Windows carefully left unlocked, doors mysteriously bolted from inside. Furniture slightly shifted, as if in a silent conversation with an unseen presence. Local merchants reported missing tools, inexplicable scratches on doors, or footprints that appeared and disappeared without logic. It was as though the killer not only took lives, but toyed with the city itself, leaving signs for some private amusement or darker ritual. Even the surviving neighbors' accounts grew inconsistent. Fear is an unreliable narrator, and in the dense fog of Ratcliffe Highway, everyone had a story slightly askew, each one believable enough to unsettle yet inconsistent enough to frustrate. Something was slipping through cracks, something that didn't fit the neat boxes of motive, means, or opportunity. And in that gap, the murderer thrived. Every new report, every new witness, added layers to the mystery, making the truth harder to grasp and the fear exponentially larger. By this point, a chilling realization had begun to settle over the neighborhood. The killer wasn't just a man. He was a force that understood the mechanics of terror, the fragility of domestic life, and the terrifying ease with which society could unravel under sustained threat. The deepening mystery wasn't merely about identifying a murderer. It was about confronting the fact that civilization, in these narrow streets, could be torn apart in hours, leaving blood, fear, and unanswered questions in its wake. The investigators arrived like fumbling shadows, ill-equipped for a puzzle designed to unsettle even the most seasoned mind. Bow Street runners, London's early attempt at policing, took the lead, their coats stiff and their authority fragile against the creeping chaos. They cataloged bodies, measured wounds, and interrogated witnesses, but the more they uncovered, the more contradictions emerged. One report claimed a single assailant. Another suggested multiple culprits. Blood patterns implied a precise, almost surgical hand. And yet, no footprints led convincingly to the killer. Detectives speculated, scribbled notes in fading ink, and theorized. Perhaps it was a man seeking revenge, a foreign spy, or a lunatic driven by twisted ritual. Some suggested the killer might be a dock worker, intimately familiar with the back alleys, able to slip through shadows like a ghost. Others posited someone wealthy, above suspicion, capable of evading scrutiny by virtue of privilege. Each theory was as plausible as it was horrifying, because the killer had left no signature beyond meticulous carnage. Clues that might have seemed minor became magnified under scrutiny. A knife left slightly askew on a counter, a window unlocked but untouched, a scrawled message that seemed almost like mockery. Even mundane objects, the position of a chair, the tilt of the table, were examined for hidden meaning. One detective muttered about a choreography of horror, as if the murderer had staged scenes to communicate something only he understood. The city collectively leaned in, desperate to decode it, yet perpetually frustrated. Overlooked details later haunted the investigators. A faint footprint in sawdust that was dismissed as a child's play, a piece of fabric snagged on a nail unexamined, a neighbor's fleeting description of a figure in the mist, which they recorded incorrectly. Every minor oversight multiplied the uncertainty, like cracks forming in a glass ceiling, revealing how fragile the entire structure of law and order truly was. The public's imagination ran rampant. Rumors claimed the murderer wore gloves, a mask, even wielded a kind of mechanical device to silence victims instantly. Pamphlets circulated, ballads were sung, and the lines between reality and embellishment blurred. Theories collided in a chaotic swirl, some rational, some absurd, all fueled by fear. And in the midst of it, the killer or killers remained unseen, perhaps observing the panic with grim amusement. What's most unsettling is the interplay between logic and instinct. Investigators sought patterns, methods, motives. Citizens relied on intuition, superstition, and the occasional panic-induced exaggeration. Together, they built a mosaic of suspicion, so fragmented it became a labyrinth. Each attempt to navigate it only deepened the mystery. And through every step, the city learned a terrifying lesson. Methodical horror doesn't announce itself. It waits, patient, in the unnoticed corners of ordinary life. Then, just as the city clung to the fragile hope that perhaps the horror had run its course, something happened that shattered every assumption. Another household was attacked. This time, a family that had taken extra precautions. Doors were bolted, windows reinforced, candles left burning through the night, and yet the killer bypassed it all with terrifying ease. He, or they, entered silently, leaving bodies arranged with the same meticulous precision, blood pooled in deliberate patterns, a grotesque signature that seemed almost to mock the investigators' efforts. It was at this point that suspicion spiraled into chaos. Some policemen began to suspect each other. Whispers of collusion, negligence, or incompetence gnawed at the edges of the investigation. One runner confessed later that fear had frozen in the street, that he had seen shadows moving past Taylor's house, but assumed it was a trick of the fog. Courts and magistrates faltered under pressure. Public outrage swelled. London was a city trembling on the knife's edge of panic, unable to trust even its protectors. Then came the false arrest. An innocent man seized and paraded as the culprit. The evidence, circumstantial and flimsy, seemed convincing to the desperate authorities. A strange tool in his possession, proximity to the crime scenes, a nervous disposition interpreted as guilt. Newspapers declared him guilty before the courts even convened. But within days, witnesses recanted, timelines contradicted the arrest, and the man was released. The city collectively shuddered, not only at the murders themselves, but at how easily its institutions could stumble and fail. The real turning point was the dawning realization that the killer operated on an almost obsessive knowledge of domestic spaces. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a deliberate study of human behavior. Each household was not just attacked but analyzed, each victim's movements anticipated, each scream harnessed as part of the murderer's design. The meticulousness, the cold calculation, drove investigators to despair. It wasn't just a breakdown of law. It was a psychological breakdown in the understanding of evil itself. Even more disturbing were the letters later discovered, hinting at a mind consumed by dark curiosity, almost gleeful in its engagement with terror. There were cryptic notes, mocking phrases scrawled on scraps of paper, almost as if the killer had expected someone to read them and feel the same dread. By the end of this phase, Londoners understood something horrifying. The Ratcliffe Highway murders weren't random. They weren't impulsive. They were orchestrated, and the city had become an unwilling audience to a performance that had no intermission and no foreseeable end. Eventually, the city tried to close the book on Ratcliffe Highway, but closure arrived as an uneasy compromise rather than justice. John Williams, a local carpenter, was arrested and charged after some circumstantial evidence linked him to one of the murders. The public wanted a culprit, someone to blame, a vessel for the collective fear that had saturated every street and alley. Williams' trial was a spectacle. Witnesses testified in shaky voices, and the court wrestled with evidence both damning and fragile. Yet even as the trial concluded, doubts persisted. Some details never added up. The precision of certain attacks, the timing of others, and the curious disappearance of potential clues all suggested that the true perpetrator might still roam unnoticed. For every witness claiming William's guilt, another remembered a shadow that did not match his figure. Scholars and historians later pointed out inconsistencies in the documentation of the crimes, leaving historians scratching their heads over whether the official resolution truly reflected reality. The lingering questions became almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Could one man commit all the atrocities with such meticulous efficiency? Or was there another, perhaps more cunning, mind orchestrating events from behind the curtain? And what of the victims' families? Did anyone ever reconcile with the sheer randomness of their suffering, the cruel precision of their deaths? London tried to breathe again, to restore normality, but the streets themselves seemed haunted. Every foggy alley a reminder of the fragile boundary between everyday life and unimaginable violence. Forensic science, in its infancy, left gaping holes in the record. No fingerprints, no detailed blood analysis, no criminal profiling. Everything was based on observation, testimony, and a growing sense of dread. It is possible, even likely, that the murderer's identity was never confirmed with certainty. And that uncertainty, so deliciously infuriating, lingered, embedding the case into the public imagination and ensuring that the Ratcliffe Highway Murders would not fade quietly into history. The case left the city with a fractured sense of security. People barricaded doors, installed extra locks, and whispered warnings to neighbors. Yet nothing could truly undo the psychological imprint of those nights. The murderer, or murderers, taught a lesson in vulnerability, that civilization's thin veneer could be sliced through with the right combination of cunning, patience, and malice. The Ratcliffe Highway Murders did more than stain London with blood. They rewrote how a city perceived its own streets. Parents clutched children a little tighter. Shopkeepers examined locks with obsessive care, and the fog that had always been a mere inconvenience now seemed like a living thing, capable of hiding unspeakable horrors. The events triggered a deep, almost obsessive public discourse about safety, morality, and the limits of human depravity. Legally, the case exposed the fragility of early 19th century law enforcement. Bow street runners were revered but plainly inadequate when facing a predator whose intelligence and patience exceeded their protocols. Historians argue that these murders contributed indirectly to the eventual creation of a more organized police force, recognizing that a city as sprawling and dense as London could no longer rely on chance, rumor, or sporadic patrols to protect its citizens. The Ratcliffe Highway Murders became a cautionary tale, a benchmark in criminal history against which future serial crimes would be measured. Culturally, the events seeped into folklore and storytelling. Ballads were written, pamphlets circulated, and conversations whispered in parlors and pubs carried the echoes of the killings long after blood had dried. In a way, the murders became a communal scar, a reminder of vulnerability and the unpredictable cruelty that can invade the most ordinary of lives. Artists and writers of the era, fascinated by the grotesque and the abnormal, drew inspiration from the grim efficiency of the attacks, embedding elements of Ratcliffe Highway into literature, theater, and eventually modern true crime narratives. Psychologically, the shadow of these murders lingered in the city's collective consciousness. Residents who lived through the events remembered them vividly, often describing a pervasive, almost supernatural sense of being watched on narrow streets. Even decades later, the murders were referenced as examples of how calculated evil can emerge from ordinary surroundings, preying on unsuspecting victims with devastating effect. The legacy wasn't just legal or cultural. It was deeply human, an unsettling reminder that normality can be a thin, fragile veneer. And for modern observers, the fascination endures. Criminologists study the case as an early example of what would now be recognized as serial predation. Psychologists speculate on a mind capable of executing such precise, horrifying acts. And casual readers, drawn to the morbid curiosity of history, return repeatedly to the stories, the maps, and the fragmented accounts, seeking a sense of closure that may never come. The legacy of the Ratcliffe Highway Murders is both a warning and a lure. The past contains horrors that are meticulous, patient, and disturbingly human. There's a perversity in how some histories linger, how certain nights, streets, and deaths refuse to settle quietly into the past. Ratcliffe Highway is one of those ghosts. Walk the modern streets today, and you might see only shops, cafes, and the ebb of city life. Yet the memory of those December nights in 1811 hangs invisibly in the fog, like a shiver that refuses to leave your spine. It's the kind of horror that doesn't scream. It whispers, insinuates, and waits for someone to notice the cracks in ordinary life. What fascinates and terrifies is the almost intimate attention the murderer paid to the private lives of ordinary people. There was no spectacle beyond the immediate family, no political statement, no clear motive beyond fixation on control and destruction. The murders were carefully tailored acts of annihilation, a choreography performed in kitchens and parlors that the world would remember not for its resolution, but for its incomprehensibility. One cannot help but wonder, what drives a mind to study fear, to manipulate domestic spaces, to orchestrate terror so precisely? And even more disturbing, how many others have done the same, unseen in every era? There's an irony that never quite leaves me. The very normalcy of the victims amplified the horror. Had these been wealthy, notorious, or controversial people, the city might have rationalized the deaths as newsworthy but understandable. But they were ordinary, working, loving, alive in their domestic rhythms. And that ordinary human pulse, so mundane, so vulnerable, was what made their annihilation almost unbearable to comprehend. It's a reminder that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it creeps through the smallest gaps, exploiting the predictability of our lives. And so, the Ratcliffe Highway Murders endure in memory not because the streets are haunted, not because supernatural forces linger, but because the case exposes a chilling human truth. Civilization's veneer is thin, and even the most familiar spaces can conceal unimaginable darkness. We study the maps, read the letters, examine the accounts, and yet we feel unease precisely because the killer's mind, methodical and untraceable, might exist anywhere in anyone. Perhaps that is a final lesson. History does not merely record terror. It teaches it, embedding the fear of the ordinary being ripped apart, leaving us to ask with no definitive answer how close to our own homes and our own minds that darkness truly lies. The shadows of Ratcliffe Highway are not bound by time. They linger in memory, in imagination, in the whisper of fog curling along a narrow, familiar street. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.